My name is Natalie Harper. I am 32 years old, and the morning it happened, I was at my desk staring at sketches for a client's foyer when my phone buzzed with a message that split my world apart. I thought it was a note from a contractor or maybe a friend checking in, but the sender was my sister Vanessa. The words were so brief they almost looked harmless, yet they struck with the force of a hammer. Natalie, do not come to my wedding. We decided on family only. You will ruin the atmosphere. I read the lines once twice, then a third time, hoping I had misunderstood. Family only. You will ruin the atmosphere. My stomach clenched as if I had swallowed ice. My hands shook until the phone nearly slipped from my fingers. The office around me with its rolled blueprints and color swatches dissolved into a blur. All I could see was that sentence glowing against the glass screen like a cruel brand pressed into my skin. Family only. The phrase pulsed inside my skull, pounding louder than the rain that lashed against the windows. I could already picture them, the Harpers and the Clarks, gathered in glittering gowns and black suits. Champagne flutes raised under chandeliers, my mother Margaret beaming with pride as she presented her perfect daughter to the wealthy new in-laws. And me, absent, erased as if I had never existed. My throat burned. My chest tightened, and I gasped like someone pushed underwater fighting for air. This was not the first time they had cut me out. I had endured the quiet humiliations of Christmas dinners, where my chair was shoved to the corner, the Easter brunches where my stepfather Richard barked that I spoke too much and slapped the back of my head when I protested. I had endured the endless comparisons to Vanessa, the golden nurse dependable, beautiful, engaged to a man from a respected family. But this was different. This was deliberate exile written in black letters. Not an accident, not a careless slight. A decision. My mother's voice was behind it, I knew. Margaret Harper, proud, sharp, obsessed with appearances, whispering to Vanessa that my presence would spoil the photograph, that I was not real family, not good enough to sit at the same table. Family only. My pulse thundered, and the words grew louder, echoing until I almost shouted back at the empty room. I pressed my palms hard against my desk to keep from shaking apart. The coffee beside me had gone stone cold untouched, and I realized I had been holding my breath for nearly a full minute. Fury rose through the pain like fire licking through ice. I felt every scar, every memory of being shoved aside, every night I spent alone while my sister was praised, and I thought of the years I had built myself out of those ashes. Vanessa believed she was casting me into silence forever, that I would bow as always and watch her shine in her silk gown. She had no idea that the ballroom she longed to parade in was tied to me more closely than she could imagine, that the signature on the contract securing her perfect day was not hers, not Margaret's, not Daniel's, but mine. I was still trembling, still bleeding inside from the words. But underneath the hurt, a new rhythm began to beat steady and cold. They wanted me invisible, but when that day arrived, I would not be watching from the shadows. I would be standing where no one could look away, and the truth they had buried for years would rise with me. I grew up in a house where love was a performance and survival was a private war, and by the time I was old enough to recognize the pattern, it was already carved deep into my bones. My sister Vanessa and I were only 2 years apart, yet we might as well have lived in different universes. She was born with pale blonde curls and a smile that melted our mother's heart, the golden child who fit the image Margaret Harper wanted to present to the world. I, on the other hand, was darker-haired, sharper-tongued, and restless. The child who asked too many questions, who scribbled designs on the back of report cards instead of bringing home perfect grades. To my mother, I was a burden that resisted polish, a shadow cast beside her shining daughter. After my father died when I was 9, my mother remarried Richard, a man whose discipline came not in words, but in fists and heavy objects. Richard never struck Vanessa. For her, he saved compliments and allowances, but with me, he found fault in every breath. Once, when I refused to hand over the birthday money my grandmother had sent, he slammed a chair across my back so hard, I collapsed against the table, coughing through tears, while my mother watched with weary eyes and muttered that I brought it on myself. I was 12. That was the rhythm of my adolescence, a cycle of striving for approval only to be told I was less weaker, never enough. Vanessa learned early that aligning with Margaret and Richard gave her safety and praise, so she leaned into their favoritism, becoming the reliable nurse, the steady achiever who brought home respectable boyfriends and pictures of smiling patients from the hospital ward. At family gatherings, my mother would beam and say, "Vanessa is our pride, she helps people. She is dependable." Then she would glance at me and offer some backhanded remark like, "Natalie is creative but still finding her path," or "she is independent," which in her language meant a disappointment. The word disappointment echoed through my teenage years like a drum. I learned to hide my bruises under long sleeves to swallow my words, and to pour my frustration into sketches of rooms and buildings, drawings that gave me a sense of order when the house around me was chaos. By 20, I left home with a suitcase and a portfolio determined to build something that did not depend on their approval. I put myself through design school by working late nights in diners, fell asleep on drafting tables, and eventually opened a small firm that specialized in interior architecture. Every milestone was invisible to my family. When I showed Margaret photographs of my first completed project, she skimmed them and asked whether I had considered real estate instead. When I won a local design award, she shrugged and said Vanessa had just been promoted at the hospital. It was always the same message: whatever you do, you will never shine as bright as your sister. I told myself I no longer cared, but the truth was the wound never closed. I remember one Thanksgiving, I was 25, sitting at the far end of the table while Vanessa's boyfriend toasted her accomplishments, and my mother clapped proudly. I had just finished the largest contract of my career, but no one asked, no one cared, and when I tried to speak, Richard barked at me to pass the gravy and muttered that I should be grateful to even sit there. That was the last holiday I attended without an excuse. I told myself distance was safety, that burying myself in work was enough, yet deep down I still longed for one moment of recognition. My career grew quietly in the shadows. By 30, I had overseen the redesign of several hotels and partnered with a company that managed large-scale event venues. One of those venues was the Lakewood Grand, a luxury hotel with a ballroom renowned for its chandeliers and lakefront view. I signed the architectural consulting and design maintenance contract myself. My name, Natalie Harper, was in black ink on the agreement, but I never told my family. To them, I was still the odd one out, unmarried, childless, too independent, too abrasive. A woman who failed to follow the simple script they expected. They never asked how I afforded my apartment, never asked why clients called me late into the night, never cared about the dozens of people whose paychecks depended on my firm's survival. To them, I was a dropout who never delivered the life story they could brag about, and now, with Vanessa's wedding approaching, their prejudice sharpened into action. Margaret wanted a flawless presentation for the Clark family, and she was willing to sacrifice me for it. Family only, the message said, as if I had not bled in the same house, as if bruises on my skin and years of silence had not already paid the price of belonging. I sat in my office that day, remembering the scar on the back of my neck from when Richard shoved me against the banister, the sting of Margaret's hand across my face when I talked back the way Vanessa smirked when I cried and told me not to be dramatic. Every humiliation folded into this moment. They believed I was still powerless, still the girl who would accept their judgment. They had no idea that I had long since claimed a place of strength, that the very venue they believed would crown Vanessa's triumph was one I had literally built with my own hands. In my family, there was never a mystery about who mattered most, and by the time Vanessa announced her engagement, the imbalance had become a polished tradition. Margaret Harper paraded Vanessa as if she were a jewel set into the crown of our family name, while I was presented, if at all, as a shadow trailing behind. Vanessa's fiancé, Daniel Clark, came from a family with wealth and old respectability. His parents owned a chain of medical facilities, his uncle sat on a bank board, and his cousins were lawyers and surgeons. The wedding was not just a union of two people, it was an exhibition, a chance for Margaret to prove that her daughter had risen into a higher league, that the Harpers could stand proudly beside the Clarks. Every conversation with my mother became a recitation of Vanessa's virtues. Margaret would call and gush that Vanessa was working extra shifts at the hospital, that she was saving lives, and impressing her supervisors that Daniel was so lucky to marry her. Then, almost as an afterthought, she would ask me if I was still sketching those little projects, her tone making it clear she considered my career a hobby, something childish compared to the stable, respectable life Vanessa embodied. Vanessa herself embraced the role. She would smile sweetly when relatives praised her, tilting her head just so, while glancing sideways at me as if to say, "See, this is what success looks like." At family gatherings, she always positioned herself beside Margaret, allowing our mother to beam with pride, while I sat across the table like an uninvited guest in my own home. The imbalance was not only emotional, it was physical. I remember one Christmas where Margaret insisted Vanessa sit at the head of the table, claiming she had earned it for working through the holiday shift, while I was placed near the kitchen door, carrying dishes as though I were the help. My protests were brushed aside with cold logic. "Vanessa is responsible, Natalie. You are still chasing after things that do not last." The words cut, but what cut deeper was the way Richard nodded in agreement, smirking as if to remind me that in this house his opinion carried weight. In their eyes, Vanessa was a success story, polished and easy to explain at dinner parties. I was the inconvenient one, the misstep they never knew how to present without embarrassment. Now, with the wedding looming, Margaret's obsession with appearances intensified. She called me once in a rare attempt at civility, her voice dripping with false sweetness, and said, "Natalie, this event is so important. We want everything to look perfect. You understand, don't you?" It was not a question, it was a warning. She wanted to make sure I stayed out of the spotlight, that I did not risk shattering the illusion she had worked so hard to build for Daniel's family. Vanessa reinforced the message. During one tense conversation, she laughed lightly and said, "You know how Mom is, Natalie. She just wants this to be about family, not complications." I stared at her across the cafe table, realizing she was dressed in her nurse's scrubs hair, pulled back in a neat ponytail, the very picture of responsibility. And me, in my black blazer with architectural sketches spilling from my bag, looked to her like chaos disguised as ambition. She believed I would ruin her day simply by existing. The irony was bitter. While she depended on Margaret's approval and Daniel's family's money, I had built contracts and partnerships worth more than she could imagine. But to them, those achievements were invisible. Respectable meant predictable. Respectable meant fitting into their narrow mold, not daring to stand outside it. Vanessa liked to remind me that I was unmarried at 32, childless, too focused on work. She once smirked and said, "Maybe that is why Mom worries about you. You never gave her grandchildren." Meanwhile, Margaret told anyone who would listen that Vanessa would make a wonderful wife, a devoted mother, and a beacon of stability. Every word reinforced the hierarchy. Vanessa on the pedestal, Natalie in the shadows. It was exhausting to live beneath that ceiling, but it was also clarifying. By the time the wedding invitations went out, it was obvious that my presence was considered optional, even dangerous. When the text arrived banning me outright, it was not a surprise. It was the final stroke in a painting that had been drying for years, a confirmation of the truth I already knew. Yet their arrogance blinded them. Margaret and Vanessa were so consumed with polishing the image for Daniel's family that they never considered what secrets the shadows might hold. They never asked about my work with Lakewood Grand, never cared that I had walked its ballroom with architects and managers, signing documents that gave me authority over its design and maintenance. They believed their story was complete, that Vanessa would shine and I would vanish, but they did not understand that the foundations of their perfect picture had already been drawn by the hand they despised. The message banning me from the wedding burned in my mind for days, but instead of collapsing under the familiar weight of rejection, something inside me hardened. I sat at my office desk staring at the sleek black folder that held copies of my most recent contracts, and among them, tucked neatly between invoices and design plans, was the agreement with Lakewood Grand. The contract was clear. My firm, Harper Interiors, had designed and still maintained oversight of the ballroom where Vanessa's dream wedding was scheduled. I had signed the documents myself, negotiating terms with the hotel management that gave me a unique position not only as a designer but also as a consultant with final approval on large-scale events involving modifications to the ballroom interior. It was not ownership, not in the legal sense, but it was power, and power was something my family never imagined I could possess. As I turned the pages and read my own signature, I felt a sharp current of defiance pulse through me. Vanessa believed she could erase me. Margaret believed she could humiliate me, but neither of them realized that their perfect evening rested on ground I had helped lay. The realization did not erase the hurt, but it transformed it into something sharper, almost electric. For the first time in years, I felt I had a weapon not forged out of bitterness, but out of the work I had done in silence while they mocked me. Still, I hesitated. A part of me wondered whether I should simply walk away, let them celebrate in ignorance, allow myself to focus on my own projects and forget the wound. But every time I closed my eyes, I heard the words again, family only. You will ruin the atmosphere. I saw my mother's smug smile, Vanessa's dismissive shrug. Richard's cruel smirk and the urge to remain silent collapsed under the weight of accumulated rage. The days before the wedding brought more reminders of their arrogance. Margaret called relatives to boast about the grandeur of the venue, her voice full of pride, never once mentioning that her younger daughter had helped shape the space. Vanessa posted photographs on social media of flower arrangements and tastings, her captions dripping with excitement, and each image was like another knife twisted between my ribs. The imbalance was unbearable. On the third evening after the message, I found myself standing outside Lakewood Grand. The hotel gleamed with golden light reflecting off the lake in perfect symmetry. I walked through the marble lobby past guests bustling with luggage and bellboys in crisp uniforms until I stood at the doors of the ballroom. Through the glass, I saw chandeliers spilling their light onto polished floors, the very chandeliers I had approved in meetings, the pattern of the ceiling moldings that I had sketched late at night. My fingerprints were everywhere, invisible but undeniable. I pressed my palm against the glass and whispered to myself, "They cannot keep me out, not here." My phone buzzed again as I stood there, and when I looked down, it was another message from Vanessa. "Do not make this harder, Natalie. Just stay away. We need this to be perfect." The words were sweet on the surface, but beneath them lay the same cruelty, the same certainty that I was expendable. My hand tightened around the phone until my knuckles whitened. "Perfect," I murmured. Perfect for who? The rage nearly consumed me, but I forced myself to breathe, to step back, to think. This was not about throwing a tantrum or storming the doors. This was about precision, about using what I had built to show them that the shadow they dismissed had grown into something they could not control. That night, I called Emma Wright my closest friend and the only person who had stood beside me during the darkest years. Emma was a lawyer sharp and unflinching, and she knew my history with Margaret and Richard better than anyone. When I told her about the ban, she listened in silence, then asked calmly, "Do you still have the Lakewood contract?" I said yes. She exhaled slowly and replied, "Then you have leverage. Do not waste it." I hesitated, confessing that a part of me wanted to walk away. Emma's voice hardened. "Natalie, how many times have they silenced you? How many times have you swallowed the pain so they could shine? This is not about ruining a wedding. This is about making sure they never erase you again." Her words struck deep. For years I had endured alone, convincing myself that endurance was strength, that survival was victory. But now, survival was not enough. I wanted them to see me, to feel the weight of what they had done, and to know that their illusion of control was shattered. As I hung up, I knew the decision was already made. The tension that had wrapped around me like chains began to loosen, replaced by resolve. The wedding would not unfold as they expected. The Harper family had drawn a line excluding me, but I was about to redraw it with ink they could not wash away. The week of the wedding unfolded like a storm cloud rolling over the city, heavy with anticipation and dread. I kept working in my office by day, reviewing client proposals and adjusting design layouts, but every evening I heard reports filtering back through mutual acquaintances. Margaret was on the phone, constantly arranging flowers, finalizing seating charts, bragging to relatives that Vanessa's wedding would be the event of the season. Yet beneath the boasting, I caught whispers of problems. The hotel management had contacted my firm to double-check certain details about lighting adjustments and late requests for floral structures that Margaret had insisted upon. Normally, these approvals would have gone directly through me, and when the hotel reminded her that final clearance had to be signed by Harper Interiors, Margaret's composure cracked. She demanded explanations, raised her voice, even threatened to pull the booking, but the management remained calm. The signature required was mine. It was a small reminder that control was slipping from her fingers. Meanwhile, Vanessa was unraveling in her own way. She wanted perfection, a flawless display to impress Daniel's family, but nothing seemed to align. The caterer informed her that the Clark family had requested additional menu items at the last minute, straining the kitchen. The florist warned that Margaret's elaborate archway might not arrive on time. Every hiccup fed Vanessa's anxiety, and I imagined her pacing the living room, snapping at Margaret, demanding solutions. It was almost delicious to picture, though I tried to temper my satisfaction with discipline. This was not about petty revenge, I reminded myself. This was about leverage, about reclaiming dignity. Yet watching their chaos grow felt like the universe itself was tilting in my favor for once. Late one night, my phone lit with a call from an unknown number. When I answered, Margaret's voice burst through tight with desperation. "Natalie, are you available? We are having some trouble with approvals for the hotel, something about your firm needing to sign off. Can you call them and fix this?" For a moment, I said nothing, letting the silence drag. My mother, who had told me I would ruin the atmosphere, was now begging me to clean up the mess. I finally said, "Calm down, Mom. The contract is clear. Harper Interiors has authority. If you want those changes, they need my approval." She sputtered. "You cannot be serious. This is your sister's wedding. Do not make this difficult." I felt a sharp, bitter laugh rise in my chest. "Difficult. Family only, remember. You already made it clear where I stand." She hesitated, and for the first time, her voice cracked. "Natalie, please. This is important. Daniel's family will be furious if anything goes wrong." That admission tasted sweeter than any victory I had ever known. She was terrified not of losing me, but of losing face. For her appearances outweighed everything, and now those appearances rested on the daughter she had tried to erase. I did not grant her request. I told her I would consider it, and ended the call. Hours later, Vanessa herself reached out. Her tone was brittle edges fraying. "Natalie, I know you are upset, but you cannot sabotage this. Daniel's parents are arriving early, and if the hotel is not ready, it will be humiliating. Help us, please." Hearing Vanessa plead stirred conflicting emotions. Part of me wanted to cave to soothe her panic the way I had always done in the past, taking on burdens silently. But another part, fiercer and steadier, refused. I asked, "Why should I help when you banned me?" Her silence spoke volumes. Then she snapped, "This is bigger than you, Natalie. Do not make everything about yourself." The hypocrisy was astounding. I nearly shouted but restrained myself, answering coldly, "You made it about me the moment you excluded me. Now you are discovering how much you actually depend on me." I hung up before she could reply. The following day, the crisis worsened. Margaret arrived at Lakewood Grand, demanding to speak with the manager, insisting that her daughter's wedding be prioritized. She waved her hands, raised her voice, but the manager simply explained that without final clearance from Harper Interiors, the modifications could not proceed. Margaret stormed out, humiliated in front of other guests. Word reached me that she was furious, pacing at home, blaming Vanessa for not controlling the situation. Vanessa, in turn, blamed Margaret, shouting that her own wedding was collapsing. Daniel Clark reportedly grew impatient as well, calling Vanessa to say his parents expected elegance, not chaos. The Clark family's reputation was at stake, and they would not tolerate mismanagement. It was all unraveling exactly as Emma predicted. Antagonists who once wielded power over me were now flailing their confidence, shaken their masks slipping. Their crisis was not yet complete, but the cracks were widening, and I, for the first time, felt not powerless, but steady, as if all the years of silence had coiled into a spring that was finally ready to release. After days of watching their panic ripple outward, I knew the moment for choice had arrived. I sat at my kitchen table late at night, a glass of water untouched in front of me, the city outside washed in streetlight glow. My phone lay silent on the counter, though I half expected it to buzz again with another desperate call from Margaret or Vanessa. Emma came over that evening, still in her dark blazer from court hair, pulled back her eyes, sharp with the kind of calm that comes only from years of fighting battles on paper and in courtrooms. She listened as I recounted every message, every plea, every insult that came before it. Emma leaned forward, hands folded, and asked softly, What do you want out of this, Natalie? Not what they want, not what they beg for, but what you want. The question settled over me like a weight. For so long, my choices had been reactions to them, either absorbing their cruelty or trying to dodge it. But what did I want? I stared at the contract on the table, the elegant letterhead of Lakewood Grand, my own signature written bold across the bottom. I wanted visibility. I wanted truth. I wanted them to face me not as the inconvenient younger daughter, but as the woman who had built something they could not deny. For years, they told me I was less. I wanted them to choke on the reality that I had become more. Emma nodded slowly as I spoke, then said, "Then the strategy is simple. Do not hand them solutions in private. Make them acknowledge you in public. Make them see you where they cannot hide." Her words burned into me. Public, visible, irrefutable. That was the opposite of every survival instinct I had carried since childhood, when invisibility was safety. But invisibility had cost me everything, even my right to be considered family. I was tired of hiding. That night, Emma and I mapped out the possibilities. If I withheld my approval entirely, the hotel could cancel the modifications, but the event would still proceed, albeit with embarrassment. That was punishment, but it was not enough. If I intervened quietly, they would simply thank me behind closed doors and return to treating me as expendable. That would change nothing. But if I reasserted control visibly, if I reinstated the reservation, and made my presence non-negotiable, I could flip the entire narrative. They had wanted a performance for the Clark family. Fine, I would give them one, but I would be center stage. My pulse quickened at the thought. It was terrifying, but exhilarating, like standing on the edge of a high cliff and knowing the only way forward was to leap. Emma caught the look on my face and smiled grimly. "You are ready," she said. I admitted I was afraid not of confrontation, but of what it might cost me. Would I regret torching the last fragile bridge to my family? Emma's expression softened. "Natalie, they burned that bridge years ago. All you are doing now is building one for yourself." Her words steadied me. I realized she was right. Every Thanksgiving where I sat invisible, every Christmas where I was pushed aside, every slap and insult and silence, had been a slow demolition of family. What remained was not connection, but control. And I was done being controlled. By the time Emma left, the plan was carved into me. I would approach the hotel management, personally authorize the final details under one condition: the Harper reservation would be altered from 12 to 13. My presence would be written into the very structure of the day. There would be no erasing me. Margaret and Vanessa could squirm, but they would either accept me at that table or watch their entire illusion collapse. I closed the folder and set it aside, my heart steady for the first time in years. They thought they had silenced me. Soon they would learn that silence had become my weapon, sharpened until it cut clean through their lies. The day of the wedding dawned crisp and cloudless, the kind of morning that promised beauty but carried an edge of tension, like the still air before a storm. I dressed carefully, not in the muted tones my family always expected, but in a tailored navy dress that spoke of quiet power, my hair pinned neatly, my steps deliberate. As I approached Lakewood Grand, the lake shimmered like glass, the white stone facade glowing in the autumn light. Guests in gowns and tuxedos flowed through the entrance, laughter spilling across the marble steps. I paused for a moment, inhaling deeply, then walked forward as though the ground itself belonged to me. Inside the lobby, the chandeliers glowed and ushers guided guests toward the ballroom. I could hear music drifting through the double doors, soft strings setting a tone of elegance. And yet, beneath it all, my heart hammered. This was the moment where years of silence would break. As I reached the reception desk, the manager, a man named Collins who knew me from previous projects, smiled respectfully. "Miss Harper, everything is prepared. The reservation has been adjusted as you requested. Party of 13. I nodded once, steadying myself. "Thank you, Collins. You have done well." He inclined his head, and for a second I saw in his eyes the awareness that something unusual was about to unfold. I stepped into the ballroom. Light poured down from the chandeliers onto long tables set with crystal and silver flowers, rising in towering arrangements. Guests turned to look as the bridal party prepared near the dais. Margaret stood tall in an elegant dress, Vanessa radiant in white, Daniel beside her, looking proud and oblivious. For a heartbeat, no one noticed me. Then Margaret's eyes locked onto mine. Her face drained of color. "Natalie, what are you doing here?" Her voice cracked a sharp hiss disguised as a smile. I walked forward calmly, heels clicking against the polished floor, and said, "I am here as the 13th seat." "Do not worry, it is already arranged." Guests nearby glanced between us, sensing tension. Vanessa's face flushed crimson. "You cannot just appear like this," she snapped, her voice high with panic. "This is my wedding. You are not invited." I turned slightly so others could hear my voice, clear and calm. "Actually, I am more than invited. I am essential. This ballroom, this contract, this very reservation carries my signature. Without me, there would be no perfect evening to boast about." Gasps rippled through the nearest tables. Daniel blinked, confused. "What are you talking about?" I met his gaze steadily. "I am an interior architect. Harper Interiors has oversight of this venue. When your fiancée and her mother requested changes, every approval required my signature. That is why their plans nearly collapsed this week, because they tried to erase the one person whose name was already inked into the foundation of tonight." Silence thundered through the hall. Margaret stammered, "This is ridiculous. She is exaggerating. Collins, tell them." The manager stepped forward, adjusting his tie, and said professionally, "Miss Harper speaks the truth. Our contract requires her authorization for structural and design modifications. Without her cooperation, the event would have faced cancellation." Guests murmured louder now, heads swiveling toward Margaret and Vanessa. The proud facade cracked visibly as Margaret fumbled for words. Vanessa trembled, her bouquet shaking. "You planned this," she accused, tears brimming. "You wanted to humiliate me on my wedding day." I held her gaze. "No, Vanessa. I wanted to exist. I wanted to be acknowledged as family. But you banned me. You declared family only and cut me out, forgetting that family is more than a photograph." My voice rose steady, resonant. "You thought I was nothing. But here I stand, the one who made this celebration possible." Daniel stared at Vanessa, his expression hardening. "You told me she was dramatic, that she caused trouble. You never said she built this place." Margaret reached for him, her voice desperate. "Do not listen. She twisted everything." But Daniel stepped back, his eyes full of doubt. The weight of years pressed down on Margaret, and I saw her pride collapse. For the first time, she looked small, her hand trembling at her side. A guest near the front whispered, "Imagine excluding your own daughter when she did all this." Another murmured, "Shameful." The words floated through the room like daggers. Vanessa tried again, her voice breaking. "Why could you not just stay away, Natalie? Why could you not let me have this one day?" I answered firmly, "Because you tried to erase me forever. And today is not just about you. Today is the day I stop being invisible." The music had halted, the chatter stilled, every eye fixed on us. I turned to Collins. "Please ensure my seat is placed. 13, not 12. He nodded and signaled staff, who quickly adjusted the table, placing an additional chair at the head side. I walked to it and sat down, back straight, chin high, claiming the space that had been denied to me for years. Vanessa's tears spilled as Daniel whispered harshly to her, demanding explanations she could not provide. Margaret clutched her pearl's face, pale, muttering excuses that no one believed. The illusion was shattered. I did not smile. I simply sat calm and unyielding, letting the truth hang in the air. Guests avoided Margaret's eyes, some shaking their heads. A cousin of ours whispered across the table, "I always wondered why she treated you that way. Now I see." The humiliation Margaret feared most had come true, and she had delivered it to herself. Vanessa collapsed into a chair, sobbing quietly. The rest of the ceremony limped forward, awkward and fractured, but the power had shifted. For the first time in my life, I was no longer the silent outcast. I was the revelation, and nothing could erase that. The ceremony stumbled forward after my declaration, but it no longer carried the glow of triumph Margaret and Vanessa had envisioned. The guests sat stiff in their chairs, whispering behind napkins, their eyes flicking between me and the Harper women as though waiting for another collapse. Vanessa's bouquet trembled in her grip petals, loosening and scattering across the floor like pieces of her composure. Daniel tried to salvage the moment, smiling awkwardly as he guided her through vows, but his voice lacked warmth, and every so often he glanced toward me with questions in his eyes. Margaret sat rigid, her back straight, but her face pale. The practiced smile stretched thin as glass. I could almost hear the churn of her mind calculating how to spin what had just happened, how to contain the humiliation that bled openly across the tables. Yet there was no containing it. The whispers had already traveled, carried to every corner of the ballroom. Aunts leaned close to uncles, cousins to cousins, murmuring that Margaret had banned her own daughter, that Vanessa had tried to erase me, that the very space glittering around them bore my mark. The Clark family sat in strained silence, Daniel's parents exchanging tight glances, their expressions betraying disappointment. Their son had promised them a polished match, a bride from a respectable family, but what they were seeing was chaos and cruelty exposed. As the ceremony concluded and applause flickered weakly, I remained seated at the table, calm, collected, letting the tension swirl around me. When Vanessa finally stepped down from the dais, she shot me a look full of fury and despair. "You ruined everything," she hissed under her breath as she passed. I met her eyes steadily and answered, "No, Vanessa. You ruined everything when you decided I did not count as family." Margaret avoided me entirely, choosing instead to fuss over guests, her voice brittle with forced cheer. But I saw the cracks. Her hands shook as she lifted glasses. Her eyes darted nervously every time someone mentioned my name. She knew her empire of appearances had crumbled. During the reception, Daniel confronted Vanessa quietly, though I overheard enough to piece together the gist. "Why did you lie about her? Why did you hide this?" Vanessa sputtered excuses, blaming me, accusing me of timing this to destroy her day. But Daniel's face remained hard, the seeds of doubt taking root. Margaret tried to intervene, pulling him aside, but he stepped away, leaving her flustered. Around the room, conversations circled. One cousin admitted they had always wondered why Margaret favored Vanessa so openly. Another relative muttered that it was shameful to cast out a daughter while bragging about wealth. The Harper family's dirty truth had become public, and there was no pulling it back into shadow. I sipped my wine quietly, not gloating, not smiling, simply letting the weight of vindication settle. For years, I had begged silently to be seen. Now I was unignorable. The power dynamic shifted palpably. Guests who had once overlooked me now approached cautiously, asking polite questions about my work. An uncle congratulated me on the ballroom's beauty. Even Daniel's mother, stiff and formal, inclined her head with a measured respect. It was not affection, but it was acknowledgement, and acknowledgement was more than I had ever received from my own mother. Margaret noticed these exchanges, and her mouth pinched tighter each time. She had lost control of the narrative, and she knew it. The reception stumbled on food served in awkward silence, laughter forced and brittle. Vanessa barely touched her plate, tears glistening in her eyes. Margaret clung to her side, whispering comfort, but her own face betrayed panic. Every attempt she made to restore dignity only deepened the sense that dignity had been lost. I watched quietly, feeling both sorrow and triumph twist together in my chest. This was not the wedding I had wanted to destroy, but it was the wedding they had forced me to expose, and now they had to live with the truth. As the evening drew on, I slipped out to the terrace overlooking the lake. The night air was cool, the water dark and reflective. For the first time in years, I breathed freely, my lungs filling without the choke of invisibility. Emma joined me briefly, having attended as a guest at my request. She laid a hand on my shoulder and whispered, "They saw you tonight. They cannot ever erase you again." I knotted my throat thick with emotion. Inside, the music struggled to drown the tension, but it was too late. The damage was done. Margaret had lost her facade. Vanessa had lost her crown, and the Harper family's cruelty was no longer a private wound, but a public scar. In the days that followed the wedding, the cracks widened into chasms. Daniel's family, who had arrived expecting a polished union, left with guarded politeness and unspoken judgment. Rumors spread quickly, carried by relatives who had witnessed the spectacle. The story of Margaret banning her younger daughter of Vanessa's cruelty, of the revelation in the ballroom that the bride's sister had built, the very stage of the celebration, became the whispered headline of every conversation. Margaret tried desperately to regain control, calling relatives and spinning tales about misunderstandings, insisting I had exaggerated. But the truth was stronger than her spin. People had seen her face pale, her hands tremble, heard my voice ring out in the ballroom. They could not unsee it. Vanessa, meanwhile, faced fallout in her new marriage. Daniel confronted her repeatedly about the lies she had told. "You said she was unstable," he accused one night, according to a cousin who overheard them in the hotel lobby. "You never said she was the architect behind our venue. If you lied about that, what else did you lie about?" Vanessa's tears were constant, her smile fractured, and the shine of her wedding day dimmed into gossip about a marriage already under strain. For Margaret, the cost was social. Friends who once admired her perfection now avoided her, whispering that she had betrayed her own blood for appearances. Invitations slowed, admiration cooled, and in the tight circles of respectability she craved, her name became synonymous with shame. I felt the consequences ripple in my own life as well. For the first time, relatives reached out to me not with dismissive politeness, but with genuine curiosity. An uncle called to apologize for years of silence. A cousin emailed to ask about internships at my firm. Even Daniel's mother wrote a brief note acknowledging my role, thanking me for saving the wedding from collapse. It was a small gesture, but it carried weight. I was no longer invisible, yet the consequences also brought pain. Vanessa sent a message days later accusing me again. "You destroyed me," she wrote, as if my existence alone had undone her. Margaret left a voicemail, her voice trembling, insisting she had only wanted to protect me from humiliation, twisting her cruelty into false care. I did not respond. They had built their lives on control and dismissal, and now they were reaping the cost of it. The Clark family withdrew, the Harpers fractured, and the story of the wedding lingered in the community like smoke that would not dissipate. For once, the humiliation was not mine to carry. It belonged to them. A week after the wedding, I found myself back at my office, the city skyline glowing through the tall windows, the hum of work steady around me. For the first time in years, I felt light, not because everything was healed, but because the silence had been broken. I no longer carried the invisible weight of being dismissed. My family could no longer deny who I was. Emma came by that evening carrying takeout and a bottle of wine. We sat at the long drafting table, papers scattered, and she raised her glass with a small smile. "To being seen," she said. I clinked my glass against hers and answered, "To never being erased again." Yet when the laughter faded, I felt a quiet ache. The victory was real, but the wounds were older than a single confrontation. I still remembered the slap of Richard's hand, the cold judgment in Margaret's eyes, the mocking smirk on Vanessa's face. No public revelation could erase those scars. Healing, I realized, was not about forcing them to change, but about refusing to let their cruelty define me anymore. In the weeks that followed, I threw myself into work. Harper Interiors grew stronger, new contracts signed, new clients impressed by the story that had spread after the wedding. The whispers had become reputation, and reputation became opportunity. Yet the deeper change was internal. I no longer measured my worth against Margaret's approval or Vanessa's shadow. I measured it against the woman who had stood in that ballroom and refused to vanish. Margaret tried once more to call her voice soft, apologetic. She said she regretted excluding me, that she had been foolish. I listened, but did not answer, letting her words dissolve into silence. If she truly regretted it, her actions in the years ahead would prove it. Words meant nothing now. Vanessa remained bitter, her messages laced with blame, and I let them pass unread. I had no desire to engage in her spiral. She had chosen cruelty, and now she lived in the ruins of it. What mattered was not their change, but my own. One evening, I walked along the lake beside Lakewood Grand, the ballroom lights glowing across the water. I paused, staring at the reflection, and whispered to myself, "You are not invisible." The words felt strange at first, then steady, then true. The truth of that night was not about contracts or signatures, not even about public humiliation. It was about reclaiming the narrative of my life. I had spent years waiting for my family to validate me, to ask about my work, to see me. But now I understood. I did not need them to see me to exist. I existed because I built, because I fought, because I endured. And in choosing to stand that night, I proved it to myself. To anyone watching, the story might become gossip, a tale of drama at a wedding. But to me, it was liberation. It was the moment the invisible daughter became undeniable, and for the first time I felt free.